Day 234 of the Ukrainian war map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Jelsey here, and today is another quick update as I take that simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine today. And as always, I like to start off with those Russian military losses. So this is for the 15th of October 2022. In the last 24-hour reporting period, there's been an additional 400 Russian military personnel losses. Then when we take a look at the Russian hardware, a loss of 7 armored combat vehicles, for tanks 3, and in terms of artillery, 16. And also 2 choppers as well, which I've got some really basic information on that I'll mention soon too. So we'll move back across to the map now, and we'll start outside of Ukraine in Moscow, because the Russian mobilization campaign continues on the streets of Moscow, where the Russian mobilization police are stationed at key transport junction points to conscript new men to the war. Now, originally Russia was trying to limit the amount of Moscow residents for the war to avoid any civil unrest in the capital, but it looks like they've run out of options and are starting to find the leftovers in the big city now. Then we'll move across to Belgorod, just on the border with Ukraine. So there were fire explosions initially reported in Belgorod and a partial blackout in the town as well. But then later there were independent media outlets reporting that there were as many as 5 or even more S-300 surface-to-air missiles launched from Russia and from Belgorod, destined for Kiev across the border, but they all malfunctioned. And one of the 5 missiles that malfunctioned actually hit the power station, the thermal power station nearby in Belgorod, causing various blackouts as a result there. At this point, I've got to say there is no shortage of stories about Russian malfunctioning missiles. Then we'll move across to the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, where major explosions were reported this morning as a result of a Russian hypersonic missile attack. It's very likely that the enemy used a Kinzhal hypersonic missile, so a Russian type there, of course. Now, these are actually said to be very low in numbers within the Russian arsenal. In fact, these ones in particular, perhaps because they're so new, they've actually got a particularly high failure rate. The last 3 or so, from my own memory, malfunctioned, and in fact, one malfunctioned and landed on Russian soil where it made a bit of a dent. And I've got an old video from that that I've pulled up again. I've shown that one before. Then we'll move across to the Donbass front line. So moving way across, zooming in, pull out the date map as well. There was a bit of a push here. So if I was to use the date map here, so this is actually southeast of Kupiansk where there was a push. So you can see it's around there, around the Pishane area, where a settlement named Kovalivka was in fact liberated. And this is only 10 kilometers or about 6 miles from Svatove. So we need to move down a little bit here, and it's hiding. There it is, right there. So it doesn't yet show it on this map. The map's always going to be a little bit behind for various reasons, not the least of which is operational security. But yeah, so that's nice to see. That one's liberated, getting very, very close to Svatove there. And then we'll move across a bit further down to the center of the Donbass region that's highly contested, has been for many, many months, really, since the beginning of the war there to now. And Russia, of course, still attempting to take Bakhmut, the settlement here. They're, in fact, these Russian forces attempting to close in from the south and the east so far, typically through use of the contract militia group, the Wagner group. It's probably good I give you a bit of context or background here. So some of the strongest units are here with respect to the Ukrainian armed forces, if not the strongest units. At the same time, Russia is throwing all that they have into the Bakhmut region. So this is perhaps why we've seen what looks like a bit of a stalemate from both sides when you zoom out and have a look at the map over the last many months when it comes to Bakhmut. But it's not because nothing is happening there, it's because everything is happening there. So not a quiet day at all at this location. And further on, a bit of an interesting tidbit or factoid of information here. If we go down to this location, so just outside of Holivka. Now, see Shumy just to the east of Shumy there. So if we go backwards and forwards, we can see a push on the Ukrainian side. But what's so fascinating about this little push here is that the Ukrainians entered it for the first time since it's been controlled by separatists since about 2014. So maybe we'll see some living standards or settlements here, see how some people have been living on this side. For example, is there water running? Do they have intermittent power or any power? Yeah, soon to find out some interesting photos at this location. Probably not so exciting photos, to be honest. Probably some horrific ones. And speaking of some squalid conditions or some unusable hardware, the Russian forces are now sending S-60 anti-aircraft guns which were put into service in 1950 to the front lines of Ukraine now. So the AZP S-60 is a very old Soviet-towed road transportable short-range single-barrel anti-aircraft gun that was actually first designed with initial testing and prototypes in 1946. And even the truck driver, the Russian truck driver in this video, is asking what century these things came from. And this is the world's second most powerful military. Probably not anymore. Then we'll move down across to the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast here. So load that up. This one here, it's kind of hard to see. It looks like a boomerang there. Where the Ukrainian military intercepted 5 kamikaze drones, shot them down. So that's always nice to hear. Oh, but also this town of Nikopol. No stranger to daily artillery shells from the Russian side. I don't think there's been a day in this war, at least in the last 3 or 4 months, where it hasn't been shelled. And overnight, shelling wounded 2 here. The Russian forces were using Grad and Yurgen multiple rocket launchers and other heavy artillery. These Grad and Yurgen multiple rocket launchers, not very precise. They're mostly similar in terms of their capability. Oh, and really close by, so infrastructure facilities were damaged as a result of Russian strikes with kamikaze drones on the city of Zaporizhia. And a fire broke out on the spot there too as a result. And maybe perhaps a little bit of lighter news in this region. So if we go down Zaporizhia, the Russian-controlled red area, so Melitopol, where a Russian airfield was destroyed here, presumably by, for instance, a long-range artillery shell, or like the Excalibur or the HIMARS option there, always very popular. Let's just use the ruler and see how far that is. So potentially 80 to 90 kilometers, or about 50-55 miles. So we could have had a HIMARS on this near this main road with the shoot and scoot capability. So it could have driven right up, shot the airfield, and just peed off, scooted away. Okay, now we're going to move to the Kherson Oblast, really quietly a hotly contested front line at the moment as well, where you can just feel the dynamic change within the air on the ground here. So recently there was this northeastern area, a whole bunch of settlements were liberated, as you can see, indicated by the blue. And continuing further down in this northeast section, it's said that Russian units are said to be feeling the fire from above from the Ukrainian forces there. Although we can't yet see it updated on this map. Let's see. Well, what we do know, can't really visually display it, is we've got 5 separate frontline pushes from the Ukrainian side going south. So if I was to say here, just pushing down on this area right now at the time of recording, it's quite a big deal. It's a lot going on. It'll probably change the moment I upload this video. Sometimes has happened before. I get a lot of comments about it, but yeah, it's just the nature of the quote-unquote, the fog of war. And there's been said to be some unconfirmed gains at the time of recording around Milov and adjacent settlements or towns as well. But hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll get some information about some liberated territories in the next day or so. Oh, and in this whole region, potentially, the Ukrainian armed forces shot down 2 additional enemy helicopters. Some sources state up to 5, but this news is so fresh I cannot even confirm really much of anything yet. Oh, and I do have some footage in the Russian-controlled and occupied region of Novokakhovka near the bridge. So this footage shows a Russian-launched missile that malfunctioned. And mark my words, one day I'll create a compilation reel of all of these malfunctioned missiles to the backdrop of some comedic clown music. I mean, either way, someone will, so I may as well give it a crack. But on a serious note, NATO now assesses Russia is suffering failure rates as high as 60% for some of their precision-guided missiles, or PGMs for short, which could help explain why Russia failed to achieve some of even their basic objectives, such as neutralizing Ukraine's air force and air defenses, especially when Russia's military size and strength was expected to be far superior to Ukraine's, at least in the beginning. Oh, and we've got some footage here that's been released from the Kherson region. So it's said to be a Russian soldier surrendering upon advancing Ukrainian positions, potentially in this northeast area as well. I wasn't able to determine the location, but I do know it's somewhere in the oblast where Ukraine is pushing forward, so very likely that northeast location there. Oh, and it wouldn't be another Kherson Map News Day without the mention of a newly captured old Soviet-era Russian T-62M tank in the Kherson Oblast. But this time, I've got something a little new for you. So a large amount of rounds for the Russian T-62 tanks were captured by the Ukrainian army. And just as well, because the growing Ukrainian fleet of captured T-62s do well need it. Oh, and so much happening here in Kherson. So the Russian forces created a video basically communicating their low morale in Kherson. Now, in this video, they're saying that they have been in the Kherson region since the beginning of the full-scale war, that the Ukrainian armed forces are overwhelming them with armor, artillery, and drones. They're complaining they don't have quote-unquote fast wheels to maneuver, and they only have one BTR, which is an armored personnel carrier, left in their 80-person unit. But I mean, they've still got a lot of options, a lot of things they can do. They can fight, retreat, or surrender, like that last guy did just before. Now I'll move across to some news where the US announced a $725 million additional military assistance package to Ukraine. Now this package is intended to bolster Ukraine's counteroffensive efforts, and what the US will be sending includes 200 Humvees, 500 Excalibur artillery rounds. These are really good. These are the M982 rounds used on the existing M777 howitzers donated by the United Kingdom, and they are pretty decent range. But the great thing about them is they're very high precision artillery rounds, popping the coordinates from eyes in the sky, satellites or drones, whatever the case may be, and take out your target. And a whole bunch of other 155mm artillery rounds, 5,000 anti-tank weapons, some HARM, so the anti-radar missiles, and not the least of which is some additional HIMARS ammunition. And in some other news, the Ukrainian General Staff has advised that the mortality rates for seriously wounded Russian soldiers is more than 50%. So the high rate is due to the low quality of medical care available on the field for the Russian side. But it's also because of the reluctance of the Russian command to evacuate the seriously wounded in Russia. And in some other news, Putin says that he has mobilized 16,000 reservists who are already in Ukraine. And he also says that out of the 300,000 reservists Russia's defense ministry aimed to mobilize as part of their partial mobilization decree from the 21st of September that was enacted, that 200,000 had already been registered. Now, take anything that Russian President Vladimir Putin says with a grain of salt. We've learned only to judge him by his actions for some time now. But let's say of those 16,000 mobilized reservists that are now in Ukraine, no idea. Are they still alive? If not, have they defected, or are they surrounded, or all or any of the above? We know that some of them have been quote unquote liquidated. Not a fan of the terminology. Eliminated is slightly better, but yeah. And I've said it probably many times on this channel before, but for any real chance of success, for Russia to have really succeeded in overtaking Ukraine, was to declare a full mobilization from the get-go on the 24th of February. Even then, that was impossible because the general population would have revolted and not been on board with it. And so he's instead been taking this dribs and drabs approach. Because as it turns out, Russia actually was never prepared for any type of mobilization. And they didn't even know it, which is probably the funniest thing and the saddest thing too. And then in some other news, well, first of all, I'll ask a question. Does anybody remember Rasputitsa from about 6 months ago? So Rasputitsa is a season of the year when travel on unpaved roads or across country becomes difficult owing to the muddy conditions from rain or melting snow. And about 6 months ago, in March or April from memory, it turned out that the Russian army was particularly susceptible to the muddy seasonality. For instance, with their Russian army trucks. Now, Russia shouldn't have had an issue with this. It's basically their same terrain, their same weather conditions, their same geolocation. But they did, because the Russian military contractors who were designed to provide the tires for these trucks actually cheaped out on the tires and purchased cheap China-made wheels instead that was simply not good enough for this season. But at least the military contractor Oligarchs were able to misappropriate the remainder of that military funding and put it into big and beautiful yachts. But unfortunately, most of those yachts were docked in NATO ports when war broke out on the 24th of February, causing many of them to be impounded. And in another Russian military mobilization blunder piece of news I have here, so a bit of footage. So the independent Russian news media outlet named the Nova Gazeta reported that these Russian citizens were forced from a hostel unwillingly and forced into to being conscripted or drafted for the war. One of the guys said, and I quote, "They're not letting us leave. They brought us to the draft office without our consent and seized our things." And yeah, they were basically having a hard time of it. Now, at least 12 men were escorted to a draft office in Moscow from these local hostels. They have been held there for over 24 hours, they said. So, yeah, again, they're not happy campers. And to round it off with a bit of a funny, well, there's been a bunch of news today that could already be considered somewhat hilarious. But that is one of the natural outcomes of a systemically corrupt autocracy like that of Russia. So here's a bit more of a generic funny for today. It's some footage of a potentially newly mobilized set of draftees in Russia. And one of these draftees gets clipped by the front of an armored combat vehicle. But to be honest, I can't verify this footage. Actually, I don't think that it's new footage whatsoever for a whole bunch of reasons, purely because of the excessive amount of reports from Russians specifying a very prevalent lack of military personnel training prior to relocating to the front lines of the war in Ukraine. So instead, I probably think that frontline Russian conscriptovich wishes he was this guy. Okay, I'm going to keep it there for today, guys. So thanks for watching. Please leave a comment, subscribe, hit that like button, ignore the trolls and their misinformation in the comments, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.